So I really wanted to talk about this idea of a Shane and I guess Carl series, or I guess it would be a Shane, Laurie, and Carl, like what if series in some way, and whether or not that was actually possible. Like, could we see something like that? I know in terms of getting everyone to come back and like do a story like that, like that's something that would be pretty difficult, right? I think that in terms of like for John Bernthal to come back and like be convinced that this is a really great story to do, you would have to come up with a really great story and a really good reason to do something like that. I think there's a way that you can do it for sure, but I think that, yeah, you would obviously have to convince John Bernthal to come back and play Shane, and also AMC as well, to do a what if series, because there's a lot of issues with doing a what if series, because would it hurt The Walking Dead overall in terms of like the other shows and what's going on with that story, right? So there's a lot of things there, but after watching Daredevil Born Again and seeing John Bernthal's return as the Punisher or Frank Castle, it really just like I really want Shane to come back to The Walking Dead in some way. I wish that it was possible, because honestly, he is one of the best characters. John Bernthal was one of the best like cast members of the show, and so I want to talk about what a spin-off series with Shane could actually be about and whether or not it could be possible. So before we go any further, make sure to be a subscriber if you want to get all my Walking Dead content like this. The Walking Dead Dead City will be out in 40 something days from now, so we're very, very close. The trailer's going to be out at any point now, and so as soon as it's out, I'll do a video breaking down everything there, and yeah, I'm excited because The Walking Dead's almost here, but let's get into what I wanted to talk about here. So the thing with Shane with The Walking Dead is that he's Rick's equal, right? Like, in terms of all the characters on the show, even when you look at a character like Daryl, like, I wouldn't say he's necessarily like Rick's equal in the sense that, Rick met Daryl later on, and Rick and Shane were pretty much, they were brothers from the beginning. And so when you look at Shane and Rick, it's really easy to sort of compare the two in terms of, decisions that they made and like where they stand on certain issues. And so the thing with Shane, like all of these years later, whenever Rick has to do like something big or there's like some big decision to make, there's always the question of like, well, what would Shane have done, right? And I think that it's because Shane is such a popular character, and I think the performance of John Bernthal, as Shane, it really is like, he's one of the best characters, like, of all time. Like, he really is honestly a really incredible character, and he's missed on The Walking Dead. And so could he come back in a what if series? And like, what would the story be about? I think that this series should focus on something totally different in terms of the story. It should be many, many years after Herschel's farm. Rick died during the ending of season 2 instead, and maybe at this point, Laurie and Carl are still alive, because that was the whole thing with Shane and Rick back in the day, was that Shane kept saying to Rick, like, you can't keep them alive, like, you're not able to keep them alive at all. And the thing about that is he was right. Like, Rick wasn't able to keep them alive, and who knows if Shane was going to be able to do that, but it would be such a crazy moment for this series if it was set many years later and Carl is now an adult, because obviously Chandler Riggs is much older, to see that Shane actually kept him alive. I think that that would be such a crazy moment to just like start with this series. I mean, obviously it's going to feel like we're watching like the villain story in some way, because Shane is living what Rick's old life was, right? And now he's with Laurie, and like Carl's basically his son at this point here. How does Carl view Shane overall? Like, are there differences there? And in terms of writing the story, you would have to do it where I feel like you have to really stick with that, because I think that if you start to get into some stuff where Carl slowly realizes that Shane was wrong, or like his father was right, this and that, then you start to get into like what the Walking Dead story already was. And so I feel like you would have to stay with certain elements of the story here, where for Carl, I mean, this is literally all he knows, right? He basically grew up in the apocalypse. Like, he remembers his father from like, before the apocalypse, but really for the last however many years, it's been Shane and his mom, right? And I think in terms of the casting, it would work really well. I think that Sarah Wayne Callies could come back and play Laurie. I think she would, because her and John Bernthal seem to be really good friends, and honestly, I think that would be really, really incredible. I think it would work really well. I think Chandler Riggs would come back to play Carl in this way. I mean, there is the whole Rick and Carl dynamic that, like, again, this series here might have to touch on that, because obviously Carl was like Rick's motivation, right? And like, that was literally why Rick tried to survive and fought so hard to survive every single day, that to have Carl in a totally different place, I mean, that's the thing, is you would have to have a different version of the character. Carl wouldn't be the same Carl that, we saw in Rick's version of this story. Carl would be a totally different person. He would probably be a lot more like Shane now, right? And so maybe that's something that people don't want to see overall, but I think that that is a way that you could do something like this. And the one thing about doing a series like this, like if you sort of broke the story away from, the farm storyline, you don't have to go and do the prison storyline or the Terminus storyline or like the Savior arc or the Whisperers, right? Or the Commonwealth. Like you could just do your own storyline and just say that, well, after this point here, they went and did something totally different. This way, you don't have to bring back the same characters. You don't have to build like very similar sets or like, you know what I mean? You don't have to do all of that. Maybe some characters show up, like some of the characters from the farm, like maybe some of the characters stayed around or something like that. I could totally see that would be really cool. Maybe Andrea actually survived. But I think the most important thing with this is that Carl would be back, right? I think people would want to see Carl come back and get like a really amazing story, because that's one of the things with The Walking Dead that like, in terms of Glenn's death, that was a death that obviously made people stop watching the show, but I don't really see an issue with it overall. It didn't hurt the story at all. It was just a really crazy scene overall, but in terms of the story, it made a lot of sense. But Carl's death, that's the one that really, I think, hurt The Walking Dead because of its overall like legacy in terms of the future and what you're able to do with a lot of stories, and like having Carl around right now, doing a series on Carl much older just makes a lot of sense. Like if you could have Carl in the story right now, scenes with Rick and Carl, like everyone would love that. But killing off Carl hurt the show so much. Like it honestly really did. And I think bringing him back, even though Rick's not there at all and you wouldn't necessarily get that, it would be so cool to have him back. It really would in some way here. And in terms of like how you would do this story, I would say that it could just be a 10 episode limited series. It could literally be a short series on like, what would happen here, this and that, or it could be a 4-season thing. It doesn't have to be a whole like series where it's like, 10 or 11 seasons like The Walking Dead, right? Like this could actually just be like a limited series, or even again, like a 4-season thing. And I know that this seems insane, but the one thing about it is that people would watch this. Like, that's the thing. When you see Jon Bernthal acting as the Punisher and whatnot, like in Daredevil Born Again, it's absolutely incredible to see, what he can do in those really crazy emotional scenes. And you want to see that again. Like you really do want to see that. And I think that in terms of doing like a new series with Shane and Carl and even Laurie, like I really think that if you brought Laurie back as well, it would do so much for the characters. Just that whole dynamic, and you could sort of bring up some of the drama from when like Rick died all those years ago. Maybe there's other stuff that happened there. Maybe they don't know that Shane killed Rick or something like that. Like there's a lot of things that you could do there, right? Again, I think if it was a 10 episode limited series, that could be the point of it right there, is that you explore the idea that like Shane actually killed Rick back then. He kept it a secret all of these years later. He kept them alive, and then maybe Carl and them find out in the end, and maybe Carl's different, but slowly he becomes who he would have been, and maybe he lived a lot longer. Maybe he's actually alive now. He had to do a lot of things that maybe he didn't want to do, but he learned that from Shane. But the point is, he's alive. But is that a good thing? Because again, that's one of the things that we'll all wonder about, right? Like if Shane was able to keep Carl alive, would Carl have been a really great person later? Or, you know what I mean? It's one of those things that's really sad in terms of his death on the show, because Rick really fought so hard to keep him alive. And it's just one of those things that when you look back at his overall story, like he's the one character that should be around still, because I think that it hurts Rick's story that he wasn't able to keep him alive. There's a lot of things that you can look back on and be like, well, Shane was right, this and that. And that's why it's really cool to see Judith like still alive, because she was obviously born during the events of season 3, and like just to have her around still, like that's very cool. But Carl was just a little different, because Carl was there from season 1. Carl was Rick's original motivation. And that's the one aspect to this that I think we should also wonder about, is like, what about Judith? Would Judith be alive even to this day? I mean, I think that would be kind of cool. You could get the same actress to come back and play the role. It would just be a really interesting dynamic to see that, right? Like Shane, Laurie, Carl, and Judith, and to just see how that story would work out, and to see, a lot of the arguments that Rick and Shane made back in season 1 and 2, and how things would play out differently. Because I think that at certain points, Rick was obviously right, but the thing is, it is the apocalypse, and when you look back at season 2, even though some decisions were pretty harsh, I would say that Shane had the right mentality in some ways to be able to keep them safe, right? Because if you look at it later on, like Rick basically became Shane, at some points during The Walking Dead. So I feel like it would be kind of cool to actually see that, if like maybe at some point Shane starts to realize that Rick was actually right. There's a better way to write all of this and put all of this together, definitely, but I really do think that doing something like this, if you were ever to do a what if series, it would have to be this one. I think a Shane What If spinoff series would be absolutely incredible. A lot of people would watch. The ratings would be absolutely insane. And again, that's why people would want to watch. I mean, if you look at Tales of the Walking Dead, like they did really crazy stories there. This isn't that insane compared to that. So I think that this is something that could happen, but is it ever going to happen? I don't really know. Overall, I would definitely be really excited for something like this to actually be announced. And I think a lot of people would honestly watch this. I think that it would be very, very successful. There's a reason The Walking Dead is very successful. It's because people love the characters. People love the story. And I think, a lot of people watched The Walking Dead back in the day to the point where I think people really remember a lot of that story and, what the characters were like in those first couple of seasons. The spinoffs are doing really great right now. And I think the reason is because they're doing stories that are very similar and very simple, just like they used to do back in the day. And they're focusing on the core characters, right? Which I think is something that you definitely need to do. And I think towards the ending of The Walking Dead, they never really did that as much. But there's some core characters that, obviously we haven't seen in a while. And I think that bringing Shane back in like a What If series would be absolutely like really incredible. I mean, there's so many characters that, I would want to see back, like the governor, like doing a backstory on the governor. Morgan as well, I guess that would be more for like a reunion with Rick Grimes, but there's so many characters you can bring back to do a What If series or even just like an origin story or something. But I think to have John Bernthal coming back to play Shane, and also because you could bring Carl back as well, like it's just something that is easily like so doable. Everyone would understand that it's a What If series, and it's just sort of like, well, what if this happened differently and Rick actually died all those years ago? Like, what would the story be like now? It's 10, 15 years later, and we see what life is like now for Shane, Laurie, Carl, and Judith. It could be a 6-episode, 8-episode, or 10-episode limited series. I mean, honestly, I don't even care what. I would just love to see something like that. I think it would be really amazing. But definitely post all your thoughts down below. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.